Hello, I'm the Dark Master, and welcome back to the Tale of the Trilobites. In this episode, we shall be continuing the coverage of the 11 different orders of trilobites. This time, we shall be covering the newest order of trilobites to be recognized, the Trinucleida. We shall discuss their long taxonomic history, how they relate to other trilobites, their internal relationship and diversity to be found within the group, their diagnostic traits that could help you identify them in the field, what their ecology potentially like, and in the end, what exactly happened to them. Let us start, as always, with that taxonomic history of study, as it's actually longer than normal and rather interesting to learn about. It has some interesting trivia to it.
But when does a comet become a meteor? When does a candle become a blaze? When does a man become a monster?
Alright, so the Trinucleida and their first members were recognized all the way back in 1847 by Hall and Corday, who first recognized these guys as a group. Sadly, shortly after that, they were thrown alongside pretty much all early trilobites into the wastebasket order that is the Palaeogeography, which are a group I've already covered in depth in episode 4 of this series. So go back and watch that if you're interested in learning more about that absolute mess of an order that is in many cases needing of severe revisitation by taxonomists. Eventually, the Asaphida would be broken off from the Palaeogeography due to having a shared eventual median searcher in 1988 by Richard Forte and Brian Chatterton, two notable trilobite paleontologists who have made numerous contributions to the field. I've also covered this order before, so check out episode 7 of this video series if you'd like to learn more about this highly diverse order, and had some of the largest trilobites to ever exist found within it. In this time, due to the presence of preoccupadal globella tubercles and a broadly similar larval stage, as well as a Mearidian cephalic searcher, the Trinucleida were included as a superfamily of this order, the Trinucleida. This decision, made around 1988, stood firm for a significant period of time. However, in 2020, a paper released by Arnold Bignan, Beatrice G. Weisfield, Emilio Vaccari, and Brian Chatterton again reassessed the superfamily Trinucleida and found that they were not in fact a superfamily of Asaphida, but rather a separate order unto themselves. They argued that the traits used to justify their inclusion had evolved multiple times, including the larval stage, whose similarities were due to similar living conditions, and the cephalic axial tubercle migration is more due to the increase in globella size due to different feeding habits / eating preferences. It seems that the Trinucleida, much like the Asaphida, represent a distinct line that emerged out of the cluster mess that was the Palaeogeography, but at a later point around the beginning of the late Cambrian. Ironically enough, it's around the same time that the first Harpida emerged. Due to their recent recognition, there's been little research into them as a whole, though individual genera being known for longer do have a little bit more research into them. Heck, they don't even have their Wikipedia article right, which still lists them as a superfamily of the Asaphida, even though that's not been true for the last 4 years. Hopefully this can be fixed in the near future, but hey, at least given how poorly made this article is, no one can accuse me of just Googling it and reading it off like they do for my other videos, because they completely underestimate how much research I do for these videos. But with that, we shall now be discussing this group's diagnostic traits, aka the ways in which you could potentially identify them if you happen to stumble upon one in the field while exploring. Alright, So these guys are rather distinctive. Starting with the cephalon or head, they usually have rather small eyes or in many cases lose them entirely. The glabella is convex, with furrows of the glabella usually numbering 3 or less. The facial sutures are marginal or opistoporion. They also have long genial spines or perforated ridge slash fringe along the head, though obviously not all had either of these, especially earlier forms. By the way, if any of the terms I use confuse you in this section, please consider checking out episode 2 in this video series, where I go in depth on a lot of trilobite terminology that is specific to the group, and I think it'll really help you out. But anyway, returning to the head slash cephalon, their hypostome or mouth is usually very countermintant. Going down to their thorax or body, it's usually rather short, with 5 to 8 body segments, though one genus, Selenocome, could have up to 30. Lastly, the pygidium or tail usually is smaller than the head, wider than it is long, and roughly triangular or semicircle in shape. As always, though, this is a general outline. With trilobites, there are always exceptions, and plus, not all fossil specimens preserve perfectly all of the diagnostic traits, so really, you should always check out your local museum and ask them, as well as any specialists, as they can really help you identify any local trilobites you may find. Far better than I can, as you know, I don't know every single genus of trilobite in existence. Now let us go on and cover the diversity to be found within the group as a whole and see how wonderful they really are. So, in terms of diversity, unlike pretty much all the previous orders I've discussed before, it's actually a lot simpler, though. Given it is so newly recognized, it may well change in the near future, but as for now, of writing this script, there are no suborders or superfamilies, for this order is instead just consists of 5 families, though the first is a bit controversial. First and smallest of these are the Laostrachinidae, which only contains 4 genera. The most notable one is the genus Laostrachina from Yuan, China, that gave the family its name. I will point out, though, that some sources claim that it's actually a Pedicopaurida, but that's also disputed. Plus, I just love to showcase trilobites, and I didn't mention this in the Pedicopaurid episode, so I figure including it here would be fine. Just keep in mind that it may not actually be a Trinucleida, but still very interesting. Luckily, the remaining 4 families are not as contentious. Next, we have the Diagnostidae, which consists of 9 genera, the most notable ones of which include the boomerang-like Diomidae and Trinucleoides, which is the genus that gave the group its name and one of the first to be recognized. The next family, the Alastapicidae, is larger with around 25 genera or so. It is also includes the members of the family Orometopidae, which used to be recognized as its own family but has since been subsumed into this one. Notable genera include Selenoceme, which was unusual for its large, long body, with many more body segments than is the norm for this group, and seems to have been particularly deep-dwelling, and Aegekina. The next family, the Rapioporidea, is larger still with a total of 38 genera, many of which are iconic, such as the very bulb-nosed Bulbaspis, which had several species. Then there was Amphix, which also had several species, some of which had proportionally the longest spines on any trilobite in existence. But my favorite has to be Pytine. Sure, it's not as elaborate as some of the others, but I don't know, I just think it looks very cute, and is a much better representation of the group as a whole. The fifth and final family in this group are the Trinucleida. It was the largest in terms of size, with a grand total of 52 genera. The most famous has to be Cryptolithus, dating from the Ordovician and known from rocks in what is now the US, UK, Venezuela, France, Morocco, the Czech Republic, Canada, and Turkey. Clearly, this was a very successful genus that had 14 species and is perhaps the most well known member of this order, even if, honestly, this group is probably the most obscure order of all trilobites. Overall, the diversity of this group is pretty fair. Not minuscule, but also not anything astounding. And I hope to have given you a fair sampling of how they looked and were. Now let us go on to the ecology of this group, aka how they may have lived as actual real life animals and fit within niches in a broader context. All right. So in the early days, the Trinucleida were a lot like other trilobites, nothing really special. They had eyes and lived as generic bottom feeders, and indeed the genus Amphix has even been found with adults lined up like a conga line. This is actually a behavior we see in modern spiny trilobites, who migrate by keeping in physical touch with one another, head to tail. And touching each other's exoskeletons, they can make a noise which discourages predators due to being annoying. It is highly speculative whether they made these noises or not, but they do seem to have done similar migrations, potentially either looking for food or maybe going to find some mates. As for the more derived members, well, the lack of eyes indicates that many species either lived in muddy areas or, given the rock deposits in some cases, the deep ocean's abyss, where light is non existent and thus sight is really not all that useful and thus easily lost without negatively impacting their success. Another thing that the head can teach us is the unique manner in which these guys fed. You see, thanks to the large head, these guys, alongside several other groups like the Harpida and some members of the Protida, were capable of forming a large space. With this, large head, the body of the animal would be suspended above the seafloor when it was, laid down. From there, the legs could stir up the sediment, and the resulting water flow would allow the animal to filter food out of the bottom. A close real life analog would kind of be seen to a lesser extent in the modern horseshoe crab, with its large head. The Trinucleida would have been exceptionally good at this, as unlike other trilobite groups such as the Harpida, their heads had a row of pits along the brim of their head, which would have allowed for water to enter through, creating a stronger outflow from the chamber, and thus a more effective filter feeding lifestyle. The spines on their head would have also aided this, as well as being generalized predator defense. Speaking of predator defense, they would have also been able to enroll like a lot of other trilobites. Unlike other trilobites, however, they utilized discordial enrollment, which involves the flexing of only the anterior portion of the thorax, while the rest of it just sort of acts like a closing lid. This kind of enrollment is seen mostly with those who have really large heads and thus don't need to completely enroll the rest of their bodies to effectively cover themselves. This is also seen in harpids as well. Of course, not all of the Trinucleida were like this. Many forms lacked these specializations and some still had eyes. And no doubt what I have such described is a fair if generalized picture of them as creatures. Now let's discuss the evolutionary history of the group and in the end see if we can answer the question of what happened to them. Alright, So the Trinucleida seem to have emerged at the start of the late Cambrian, around 497 million years ago or so. They were a relatively minor part of the trilobite fauna at the time, and frankly, were never really a big part of the trilobite fauna throughout their time. Though diverse and successful, they never really became a dominant group, sort of staying on the sidelines throughout their history. And they went through the end Cambrian extinction fairly unharmed, while other groups like the Pedicopaurida and Diagnostica were heavily hurt. They achieved their highest success and diversity during the Ordovician, with several lineages developing similar pharynges and leaving the shallows for the depths. This may have saved them, for they managed to make it through the end Ordovician mass extinction that ended the successful Saphids, Pedicopaurids, and Diagnostica. I think it's because while they did go into the depths, they didn't quite specialize quite as much as, say, the agnostids and pedicopaurids did, the latter of which were limited to hydrothermal vents. It did hurt them, though, but they did continue into the Silurian, albeit at a reduced level. Exactly when the last Trinucleida went extinct is kind of disputed. I've seen some sources say it was at the end of the early Silurian, others say they made it to the end. Overall, the Silurian is a really underappreciated time period, despite the fact that it's very notable for having the first jawed fish and some of the first animals on land. I think it's because it lacks a huge, notable, dominant big group. The Ordovician had, the orthocones, the Devonian had placoderms, and all the jawed fish were diversifying. I mean, Eurypterids were at their peak during the Silurian, but they existed in the previous periods, as well as the later ones that I mentioned, and I think it's a darn shame. The Silurian is really cool, and sadly, the end Silurian mass extinction event is similarly obscure. Known as the Lau event, it was very minor, not even ranked as one of the big five, and it seems that the Trinucleida were the only notable extinction at this time. Though as to why they went extinct, sadly, their decision to specialize in the depths probably did save them in the Ordovician. In the long term, it may have prevented them from diversifying to allow them better flexibility in the future. While they weren't necessarily as specialized as, say, the Pedicopaurids and Diagnostica, they still were greatly limited to a selection of genera. And as always, specialization leads you more sensitive to change. And while we often like to assume the abyss of the ocean is sort of a safe space, and in some cases it can be, it's not immune from extinction. And it seems likely that these guys faded into death, perhaps due to environmental changes, as well as the evolution of new predators like jawed fish that they hadn't really encountered before. Though sadly, unlike all the other Trilobite orders I've discussed to them, we can't really be quite certain as to why they went extinct. They didn't go out with a bang or a super important mass extinction. So sorry if this is a bit of a disappointing answer. Despite this somewhat meager ending, they were a cool group and deserve more attention drawn to them. I mean, as I stated before, even their Wikipedia article hasn't been properly updated. But what can we learn from them in the end? Well, we learn that success is not guaranteed, even if you manage to overcome a big challenge, and that if you rest on your laurels too much, you can very easily fail to grow afterwards and succumb to something later, which only sets you up for, potential future failure in life. We must always be vigilant, even after great successes. Anyway, I'm the Dark Master, and if you liked this video, liked it, but if you loved it, consider liking and subscribing, and join me next time on The Tale of the Trilobites. And we shall be meeting a group I mentioned a few times in this video, the Harpida, which, while the least diverse order of trilobites, I think you'll enjoy learning about. Until then, take care, and have a wonderful day.
Sorry, man, for feeling the way I do. Oh yeah, open wide and they'll shove in the meaning of life. Oh yeah, not for me, I'll do it on my own. Oh away.